This is a historic day, not only in our province, but in the country. It's the first time in the British Commonwealth that the people actually had a say in how it is they're taxed.
That is Bill Vander Zalm from last Friday as he was celebrating the victory for voters in British Columbia when they rejected the HST, brought in a rather underhanded fashion by Gordon Campbell, the former Liberal Premier of British Columbia. Now, I think that it's a good thing what happened there. We'll turn to John Robson to find out what he thinks, because I have a sneaking suspicion Robson's going to support the idea of the HST.
I am, in fact, of the view that it was a better tax, but I'm still very happy with what happened.
Okay, well, how do you square that? How are you happy with it being a better tax, but still happy with what happened?
Because this was a tax that was imposed without the people's consent. And I say this because although it was imposed by people they'd elected, they had been told it wasn't going to happen. And then the people who told them that got elected and brought it in. And this is a violation of the spirit of parliamentary self-government. And I think it's quite clear that people were so incensed by the way it was done that they were not focusing on the details. And funnily enough, this has an echo in the American Revolution. The critical moments in the American Revolution, the Americans revolted against a tax cut.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, because it was not done with their consent. And they said, we are free people. We cannot have tax laws made without our consent. This is part of our ancient liberty. It goes back as a statute, 1297, when Edward I promised Parliament, de tellagio non concedendo, no taxation without representation. And in fact, this came up during the debates on Confederation. I found a quotation from somebody, and I think it's interesting because you've never heard of this guy. I promise, unless you're a serious antiquarian. His name was Isaac Le Viscount. He was talking in the Nova Scotia House of Assembly in April of 1865 against Confederation. And what he said is, the right of being taxed only through the action of their representatives has always been considered one of the dearest privileges a free people can possess, and it is one that comes home to every man's mind. At present, not a single penny of taxes can be imposed upon the country except with the consent of its people. His objection to Confederation, as a Nova Scotian, he said, but what will be the result after we are annexed to Canada? And he was addressing a legislature and a debate across Canada where nobody doubted that this right, no taxation without representation, was a battle cry. But they just argued about where would we get better representation.
I want to hammer home this point, because every time I say, I put it out on Twitter last Friday. I was on vacation, but I heard the news about BC and I said, great. And I just put out a statement. You cannot tax without the consent of the governed. And people started arguing with me, saying this isn't a Canadian way of thinking. This is an American thing. And I keep saying, no, it is not. This is as Canadian as maple syrup.
Yeah, it's astounding. The kind of language, again, we have been cheated of our founding. And in losing our founding, I mean, the Confederation debates are the first ones that were recorded and printed in this kind of detail, and then they just went out of print. And they were out of print in, until Bill Gardner and Janet Eisenstadt and their colleagues brought them out about 20 years ago. And it's astounding when you look through it and you see what people were and were not arguing about. There's another great thing. This is John McKechnie in the Prince Edward Island House of Assembly. Somebody had spoken about British liberty, and he stood up and he said he was delighted to hear this sort of John Bull grumbling, but he said he didn't think those who'd been conquered at the Battle of Hastings should be lecturing those whose Caledonian ancestors had repelled the Romans and everybody else on the subject of maintaining your liberties when they were under siege. It's extraordinary the kind of language you hear if you've been taught Canadians are not a free people and they don't insist upon their liberties. If you look at what they actually said in the founding of this country and on, you get a completely different picture.
Well, let's bring up some quotes and we'll put them up so people can read along. Okay, so we got a quote from George Brown.
Starting with George Brown. Why Confederation? Brown being a famous person. Sometimes you think famous people can mislead you because they may be exceptional. He said, the proposal now before us, Confederation, is to throw down all barriers between the provinces, to make a citizen of one, citizen of the whole. That Confederation would remove impediments to free enterprise in order to generate common citizenship. Not a sentiment you customarily associate with the founders. But then again, as I say, people might think Brown, well, he's unusual. What was the average person involved in these debates saying? And that's why I think that the next one is very interesting.
This is Christie.
His name is David Christie. He's the Legislative Council of Canada. And he's talking about this very point you raised, that's an American idea. He says their institutions have the same features as our own. There are some points of variance, but the same great principle is the basis of both. That life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are the unalienable rights of man, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving They are just powers from the consent of the governed. This is the secret of the strength of the British Constitution. Are you listening, everybody? The British Constitution, and without a free and full recognition of it, no government can be strong or permanent. As theory, this comes from John Locke, who was British and who was not just the teacher of the American founding fathers, but of our own. As practice, it goes back, again, Edward I being forced to tell Parliament no taxation without representation. King John.
Magna Carta, King John, English Bill of Rights. These are documents. People say, well, that's old British stuff. It doesn't apply to Canada. In the argument over the Afghan Taliban prisoner scuffle in Parliament, the English Bill of Rights was cited by House of Commons Speaker Peter Milliken as one of the reasons the government had to hand over the documents.
Yeah, and this idea, oh, that was back then as though, I don't know, we had electroshock therapy in 1867 or in 1968 and therefore wiped out our past. The English Bill of Rights looks backwards, vindicating ancient liberties. So does the Petition of Right in 1628. So does Magna Carta. Magna Carta is not about a revolution in government. Magna Carta is about reestablishing the way we always did things, where the king couldn't mess with you. And it's so, I mean, you look at Gordon Campbell bringing in this tax after saying he wouldn't. He's just messing with you. He's in power, and he thinks he can't be stopped, and he thinks the legislature's been tamed. I gather it was never even voted on, and they didn't mind that. You know, we need to get our legislators back.
That is taxation by royal prerogative, and it cannot stand. And I think the same thing has to happen when you get Dalton McGuinty out there saying, you can't, I won't bring in any new taxes, and then he brings in the health tax and the eco tax, and he's got a long list of taxes he's imposed on us. But we shouldn't reward these people with another vote of a majority. We should throw them out.
Yeah, the fault lies with ourselves, that we are underlings. And here, you know, we should talk about that good old Saxon word freedom. And now, you know, tomatoes at the ready. That's Wilfrid Laurier, if we have our third quotation here. This, to me, is an astounding thing to hear from the founder of the modern Liberal Party. He talks about that, the good Saxon word freedom. Freedom in every sense of the term. Freedom of speech, freedom of action, freedom in religious life and civil life, and last but not least, freedom in commercial life. That's the founder of the modern Liberal Party. That's not some right-wing crank. That's not Alexander Hamilton. You know, that's not letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania. That's Wilfrid Laurier talking for the Liberal Party and for the Canadian consensus. I mean, in a way, he's the last of Canada's founding fathers. He came later, but his political work made the consensus on Canada as a free country at its foundation more or less complete. And this was not, again, you think, oh, well, Laurier, yeah, but he was sort of railway, you know, what about the modern world? I can at least get you to Louis Saint Laurent and get you to 1957.
And before we go to Louis Saint Laurent, before we bring that up, this ties into what I've been saying about Stephen Harper over and over again, that he spends too much, that he's got to rein in spending, and I'll link him to the Dalton McGuinty saying we won't tax and then adds on additional taxes. Gordon Campbell doing the same thing. Stephen Harper says we'll keep spending under control, and then he doesn't. Louis Saint Laurent's quote, I know, is about spending and where government should and shouldn't be. Let's bring that up.
Yeah, 1957 election. This is a liberal francophone prime minister. Any ideas of non-essential interference by the government is repugnant to the Liberal Party. And you look at this parade of pompous, self-satisfied press releases from the current federal Tories about the ingenious new ways they found to spend money in return for your votes. This would have Saint Laurent rattling off the walls of his coffin. It is so contrary to the political philosophy that he proudly upheld, that Canada, and remember, as late as 1958, Canadian governments took less of our GDP than American governments did. That's why a writer in 1945 called us the last of the rugged individualists. Liberty is our founding tradition, and we won't get the politicians back in line until we get ourselves back in line to say this is who we are. All these British landmarks are not just antiquarian things that a stamp collector would consider out of date and petty. They are the cornerstone of our political system, and without it, we have no political system. And legislatures need to call executives to account. Stop just being trained seals with different colored balls on your noses. That's not your job. That's not what you were in the days of Edward Cook, and it's not what you are today. And Canadians need to say there's nothing to be embarrassed about in this fiery language in favor of freedom. I have this is Joseph Howe.
Okay, one last one.
1835, on trial for libel because he criticized the government, and he urged the jury to see the libel law didn't say truth was